Bill, we always hear that God is the creator. Okay, sounds simple. But what is the creation? What is a world? It's not so simple as people think.
Well, I think the doctrine of creation means that God is the source of all reality outside himself, that apart from God, everything else has been brought into being by God.
Now, what is everything else?
Well, it would include all reality, whatever realms of reality you might think it exists. It would be all physical, concrete objects. It would be time and space themselves. It would be any realms of spiritual reality that you might believe exist, such as angels and other spiritual beings. And it would include any sort of abstract objects, if you think that those sorts of things exist.
Like mathematics, 2 plus
Yes,
2
like
equals 4.
Sets and numbers and propositions and so forth. Anything that exists that is not God himself has been brought into being by God.
How about things like causation or logic, operations among ideas?
I would see things like logic as grounded in the very mind of God himself. The Gospel of John refers to God as the Logos, from which we get our word logic. It means reason or word. And it presents God as the creator of all things. It says that in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, the Logos was God. All things were brought into being through him, and without him nothing came into being. So the idea there is that God is the supremely logical agent, and logic, as we use it, is simply a reflection of the mind of God himself.
So everything outside of God himself, God is responsible for. And this is a vast number of things, anything that we can conceive of and anything we can't conceive of.
Well, anything that exists. I mean, there are, in a sense, fictional entities. For example, Sherlock Holmes. I don't think Sherlock Holmes exists. That's a fictional character. So God doesn't bring Sherlock Holmes into being unless you think that Sherlock Holmes is some sort of abstract object, as some philosophers do. So everything that exists owes its being to God, and I would say was brought into being by God at a specific time, which implies that the creation or the world or reality outside of God has not always existed. I think that most people don't understand that the idea of creation is inherently bound up with temporal considerations. These things are not just dependent upon God for their being, but they were brought into being by God.
Now, you've distinguished between creation, providence, miracles, different kinds of creation. Help me understand the differences.
Yes, this is a traditional distinction that theologians have made with respect to God's relations to reality outside of God. On the one hand, creation, properly speaking, is, as I've defined it, bringing things into being from nothing. God is the efficient cause of everything that exists. That is to say, he produced it, he brought it into existence. But he's not the material cause. He's not the stuff out of which things are made. God not only created the things, he created the stuff out of which they're made, space and time and matter and energy. All of these owe their being to God, and he brought them into being at some point in the finite past. Now, in addition to that initial act of creation, theologians have typically talked about God's conservation of the world in being. That is to say,
keeping it going.
Yes, that he preserves them in being. And were he to withdraw his conserving power, the world would be annihilated. It would vanish in the blink of an eye.
Now, that's not doesn't sound necessarily true. I mean, you could be a creator in having something created and not needed to continue with it.
Well, I guess the whole discussion is whether or not, given God's initial creation of things have any sort of ability to
exist
endure
on their
in
own.
Being on their own. Typically, in Christian theology at least, it's been argued that things are radically contingent in their existence and that therefore need to be preserved in being. So the polar opposite of creation is annihilation. And God could create things by bringing them into being, and he could annihilate them by simply withdrawing his sustaining, conserving power, and they would vanish into non-being.
The distinction being that for God to annihilate what he created, he has to withdraw his preserving action as opposed to making an affirmative decision to annihilate.
Yes, that's right. The act of annihilating an object isn't like dynamiting it or something of that sort.
Or puffing it away.
It's more of a passive action. It's just ceasing to maintain it.
Is that distinction important?
Yeah. Is it important? You threw me for a loop.
Good, I like to do that. The difference being whether God has to make an affirmative decision to annihilate, which means that the world he created has an independent existence on its own.
Right.
God can annihilate it. Or if God just withdraws his active sustenance of the world.
I think that by thinking of annihilation as the withdrawal of God's sustaining power, rather than as an active act of destruction, it underlines the contingency of the world upon God in a way that exalts God's power and majesty. Whereas if the world has some sort of positive inertia in being on its own that would require God to blast it out of existence, that would tend to make the world less contingent on God, more independent of God, and therefore would perhaps be thought to diminish God's greatness and power. So in that sense, it perhaps highlights an important difference.
But isn't this just a human philosophical intervention, imagination of which way might be better? We don't have any real knowledge of how God is actually doing it.
Well, the question would be, what philosophical analysis is the best? And I think those who would argue in favor of divine conservation would say that God's status as creator and source of all being would require him to maintain things in being, rather than think that these beings have some sort of ability to be sustained in existence on their own.
The concept of God's involvement in the world, this idea of God's providence, how does that relate to God as the creator?
I think that it means that God is involved in everything that happens in the world, and we can distinguish within God's providence or control of the world. That's what providence means. It's God's superintendence of everything that happens in the world. We can distinguish between God's ordinary providence and what we might call his extraordinary providence. His ordinary providence would be his governance of the world through the instrumentality of natural causes and natural laws.
Which God is involved in, though.
Yes.
And sustaining as a primary cause.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It's not as though he's uninvolved, but nevertheless, it's a purely natural sort of activity. And then his extraordinary providence would be God's bringing about events which lie beyond the productive capacity of natural causes. And these we would call miracles.
And you believe in those?
Yes, I think that it's very clear that if you have the concept of a being who is the creator and designer of the universe and who has therefore decided which natural laws govern the world, that they lie within his power, and that therefore such a transcendent being could easily produce events in the natural world which lie beyond the capacity of natural causes.
I think anybody would agree with the following of that logic. However, the argument would be, does that mean there was an imperfection in how God designed the natural law if he has to intervene to change that natural law?
Well, I don't think we should think of miracles as changes in natural laws. Natural laws describe what will happen given that there are no interfering factors.
Fine.
They are idealizations of what will happen under ideal conditions without the intervention of natural or supernatural agents. So a miracle shouldn't be conceived as breaking the natural law. That is, I think, an improper concept of natural law, and it's psychologically prejudicial as well. It connotes a sort of divine rape of Mother Nature, akin to violating a civil law, to say a miracle is a violation of the natural
Well, how do you
laws.
how do you define it?
I would say a miracle is an event that occurs which is beyond the productive capacity of the natural causes at that time and place.
Sounds like you're a good lawyer saying the same thing.
No, it's not, because I'm not saying he breaks the natural laws. The natural laws hold, but God is able to produce events which the natural causes themselves don't have the capacity to bring about. It's beyond their power to bring about, but it's obviously not beyond God's power. And as you say, given that there's a transcendent creator, the odd miracle for that kind of a being would be child's play.
No one doubts the logic of that. Just one wonders why God had to design a system that he has to tinker with it to change the molecular structures here and there. Couldn't it have been a nicer flow if it was designed nicely from the beginning?
Well, I think it's very important to understand the purpose of miracles. Miracles are not meant to be adjustments to the natural world to rectify imperfections. Rather, miracles are meant to be revelatory, in that they are extraordinary events that they serve as signposts that point beyond the natural world to its ground in a supernatural creator. So, for example, when Jesus of Nazareth performed miracles, he presented these as signs of the inbreaking of God's kingdom in his person, so that his miracles were not meant to be adjustments to an imperfectly operating machine. Rather, they were revelatory. They were signs that God's kingdom was breaking into human history at this point.
How come I haven't seen any?
Well, that maybe you haven't been looking in the right places. I do think
I've come to you.
All right. I think that God still is about the business of doing miracles today, but
just doesn't care about me.
Well, no, he cares about you. I mean, this is getting to a very personal level. I do think that God can do miracles today in people's lives. But I also think, and this gets back to this area of ordinary providence, that God can be operative in your life and answer your prayers without having to bring about miracles through his ordinary providence. And the key here is to remember that God, as an omniscient being, would know what any free person would freely do in any set of circumstances that he created them in. So that God can arrange for things to happen in the world without having to intervene miraculously or tinker in it, by simply setting up the circumstances and the agents in advance, so that when the time comes, the relevant events will transpire, perhaps in answer to a prayer or something of that sort, without any kind of miraculous intervention whatsoever. So we don't need to be looking for miracles in order to see God's providential hand in history. He can work through the secondary causes by means of his knowledge of what contingent events would occur in any circumstances he puts people in.
What I find interesting is the concept of God as creator has a multiplicity of different expressions, from the creation of the world from nothing, to the sustenance of it in a normal way, to the intervention or to the setting up of miracles for specific purposes, potentially if one believes in that. So the concept of God as a creator is a very broad and rich one.
It really is. It's more than just bringing things into existence. It's the initial act of creation of the world out of nothing, of all reality exterior to God. It's then the sustaining of the world in being. It's concurring with the actions of secondary agents to produce their effects. It is his ordinary providence through his omniscience of governing the world of creatures to achieve his ultimate ends. And then it is his miraculous operations in the world beyond the natural capacity of spatiotemporal causes to bring about events that would not have happened in the absence of God's special action. So it's a very rich and variegated doctrine.
Sounds like a full-time job to me.
Yes, though for an omnipotent being, it's not something he can't discharge effectively.
Bill, can the existence of God be demonstrated?
Well, I think that depends on what you mean by a demonstration, Robert. I don't think that you can demonstrate God's existence with mathematical certainty that will convince everyone.
Or make him appear right here.
Right. But I do think that there are good arguments for God's existence. There are good reasons to believe God exists.
Now, we've had reasons for millennia about God's existence, so I really am interested in your feeling of what are the best of those arguments that you're comfortable with today.
Well, one of the most appealing arguments to me personally that I find convincing is the cosmological argument for God's existence.
And what does that consist of?
Well, this is a family of arguments that tries to show that there is a first cause or sufficient reason for the existence of the world.
So everything has to have a cause?
Well, not everything that exists has to have a cause, but I would put it this way. Anything that begins to exist has to have a cause. Anything that comes into being must have a cause. And this is rooted in the metaphysical idea that being cannot come from non-being. Out of nothing, nothing comes. So if something comes into being, there must be a cause which brought it into being.
So the only thing you would exclude from that is God himself.
Well, I wouldn't exclude God from this, but I would say God never began to exist. In other words, what this argument will get you to is an uncaused, eternal first cause that never came into being.
And that's God.
Right.
Okay.
And so the key premise here will be to demonstrate that the universe began to exist, because if the universe began to exist, then it follows logically that the universe has a cause.
And that's the cosmological
Right.
argument. What else?
Well, there are other versions of the cosmological argument that don't depend on the universe having a beginning. For example, the great German philosopher Leibniz asked the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And I think probably all of us have wondered about the mystery of existence. Why is there anything at all? And doesn't there need to be some sort of an ultimate explanation of reality? And I think that that's a very plausible principle, that everything that exists has to have some kind of explanation for why it exists until you get to an absolutely necessary being which is self-existent and not explained by anything outside of itself.
Well, people would argue that there are brute facts, which means it's there and you can't explain it.
I think that there may be brute facts, but I don't think that there are any brute things, that concrete objects, things that actually exist, don't just do so without an explanation. Things that are real, that actually exist, have their explanation in causes that produce them. Or if you're talking about abstract things like numbers and so forth, they exist by a necessity of their own nature.
All right, so we have again, cosmological argument has a sufficient cause and you need a beginning.
Yes.
All right, what other arguments do you have?
Well, there's the famous teleological argument, which would say that the universe exhibits a complexity in its structure that cannot be attributed plausibly to either chance or to physical necessity, and that therefore this is best explained by saying it's the product of intelligent design.
And teleology means that from first happenings you project some sort of an end result.
Yes, it's the idea that there is an end in mind for which things exist, and so things are literally designed. And
so the teleological argument is the design argument.
Right, that's right. And new life has been breathed into this argument by the discovery of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, which doesn't seem to be explicable on the basis of physical necessity, because these constants and quantities that are so finely tuned are independent of the laws of nature, and it can't be plausibly explained by chance because the odds against it are just so overwhelming that it seems rational to think that the reason the world looks designed is because it was designed.
What else do you have in your bag of tricks of arguments?
Well, there's the moral argument for God's existence, and this would say that if there is no God, then there really are no objective moral values and duties. On this view, unless there is God to serve as an anchor point for moral values and duties, moral values and duties are just the products of socio-biological evolution. And on this view, without God, everything is relative. Human beings are just relatively advanced primates, and moral values are just something we've evolved to get along in society without killing each other off.
This argument to me sounds different in that you need to assume the absolutism of moral values. In the other arguments, you're assuming the reality of a beginning and a world, which I think everybody admits. But when you deal with moral questions, you have to make the assumption that there are absolute moral values as opposed to relative values.
That's right.
Because if you don't have absolute values, then you certainly don't need God.
I prefer to speak of objective moral values, by which I mean mind-independent values. And you're right, that would be the second step of the argument, would be to say, but there are objective moral values and duties. That is a premise in the argument. And I think
that's an assumption.
Well, it's a premise. I don't think it's just an assumption. I think that there's no more reason to deny the objective reality of moral values than there is to deny the objective reality of the physical world.
Well, that's a strong statement.
Right, and any argument that you could give me for denying the objective reality of moral values, I could construct a parallel argument for being skeptical about the objective reality of the external world. If we trust our sensory intuitions that there is a world of objects independent of us out there, I don't think we have any grounds for distrusting our moral intuitions of the realm of objective values that we perceive.
Certainly, to verify the objectivity of the external world, we're dependent upon our senses. Everybody agrees with that.
And there's no way to get outside your senses
totally.
to prove you're not a body lying in the matrix being programmed to believe in something.
All agree with that. But when you get to moral values, that's different. That's not an objective sense in the same way that everybody in every society in the history of the world would have had that same view of this chair or this carpet. I mean, they would know it's there. But if you deal with moral values, different societies have had different moral values.
Well, I think that's certainly true, though very often you will find there is a commonality among cultures that underlies the different cultural expressions of these moral values. For example, modesty is a common moral value, but what is considered modest in one culture rather than another may differ. Or, for example, cannibalistic tribes do believe in the ethic of loving your neighbor, but they don't consider people in other tribes to be their neighbors. So that while they wouldn't cannibalize their own tribal members, they would members of another tribe. So beneath seeming moral diversity, there is, I think, a common moral code.
I think there are
that
some
most cultures
tribes that
perceive.
would practice cannibalism to ingest the wisdom of their ancestors.
Well, I think you would be hard-pressed to find examples of many tribal groups that cannibalize their own people.
All right, let's go on.
Yeah.
But I think there's a difference between the moral argument and some of the others.
Yeah, I guess I don't think that's right. I mean, it does seem to me that we have good grounds for accepting our moral experience. When I talk to folks, 99% of people will say to me, yes, I think there is an objective difference between torturing a child for fun and loving that child and caring for it, that these are not morally indifferent acts. And I simply say, why distrust that moral intuition? We clearly perceive objective moral differences in the world, but if they exist, and that first premise is right, then it follows logically and inescapably that God exists.
I think that first premise is critical for the moral argument.
Yeah.
What else you got?
Well, that would be the argument that would be rooted in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. I don't think that any historian who is a purely naturalistic historian can give a plausible account of events like the death and resurrection of Jesus. I think we have here, in essence, a kind of argument from miracles for the existence of God. It may surprise most people, but the fact is that there is a majority of New Testament biblical critics who have come to believe that part of the portrait of the historical Jesus that is established by an examination of the evidence is that after his death, Jesus was buried in a tomb by a Jewish Sanhedrist named Joseph of Arimathea, that on the first day of the week following his crucifixion, that tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers, that thereafter various individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death, and that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Now, those are the generally, not unanimously, but generally agreed facts. And the question is, how do you best explain them? Well, I don't know of any naturalistic hypothesis that can explain those facts without bruising them. I think that the best explanation is the one the disciples gave, and that was God raised Jesus from the dead, and that entails that God exists.
I would think that's a rather lengthy set of premises to get to your conclusion, but I will leave that for you and,
right.
and go on to the next one.
Well, the next one would be the ontological argument. And this is the argument that the very concept of God, properly understood, implies that God exists. And the idea here is that God is a maximally great being. He is the greatest conceivable being by definition. But a greatest conceivable being would have necessary existence. He would be omniscient, omnipotent, morally perfect in every possible world.
And really existing.
Well, yes, in every possible world. And since this is a possible world, it follows that God must exist in this world, and therefore he exists. And I think that this argument is a sound argument for God's existence.
How about arguments that are personal, that you can't convince anybody else of, but that you feel?
Yeah.
I know people have them because many people
Right.
talk about it, but are those philosophically legitimate?
Oh, absolutely. I would say that my belief in the existence of God is ultimately not rooted in these arguments. These arguments provide confirmation or reinforcement for my belief that God exists. But my belief that God exists is rooted in my personal experience of God. He's a living reality in my life and has been ever since I became a Christian as a teenager. And I think that's perfectly defensible. We spoke a moment ago about our knowledge of the external world. There's no way to prove that the external world exists. There's no way to prove you're not a brain in a vat of chemicals wired up with electrodes to think that we're here in this room having this conversation. Similarly, there's no way to prove that the past is real, that everything wasn't created 5 minutes ago with built-in memory traces and appearances of age. These are what philosophers call properly basic beliefs. They lie at the foundations of our system of beliefs. Now, these beliefs aren't arbitrary. They're rooted in experience, my experience of seeing and feeling and smelling objects and remembering the past and so forth. So these beliefs are grounded in experience, but they're properly basic beliefs to my foundational system of beliefs. And I would say similarly, the belief that God exists is, for those who experience him, a properly basic belief rooted in the experience of God himself. And in the absence of some overwhelming defeater or objection to belief in God, the believer is perfectly rational to accept that God exists, just as we are perfectly rational to believe in the external world or the reality of the past.
Well, most people's internal feelings about things are acculturated because of society or family or experiences or psychological benefits or problems that people have had. How can you depend upon something that is so emotionally based to root your deepest belief?
Well, I think that an atheist, to carry this argument, would have to show that there's a particular psychological profile that religious people have. And that just has never been demonstrated throughout the world. There isn't any sort of particular psychological profile that religious believers exhibit. They come from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of belief systems, all sorts of emotional and cultural upbringing. And so I think it would be very hard for the unbeliever to try to show that this experience of God is spurious or non-veridical.
But what you're saying, though, demonstrates that all these different expressions of people's belief are vastly different kinds of gods and religions and systems and doctrines and all this mished together. But you're pointing to some core commonality among all these superficial differences that somehow proves an existence of God, yet the God that those are all related to are all different.
Well, no, I wasn't appealing to that. I was thinking of people who believe in a traditional theistic concept of God, that they don't exhibit any sort of psychological profile. Freud attempted to do this by saying that it's the projection of a sort of father figure on the heavens due to an Oedipal complex. And that's been, I think, completely evacuated of any plausibility. So I wasn't speaking of pantheistic concepts of God or other concepts of God. That's an entirely different question. What I meant was that believers in the traditional concept of a monotheistic God don't exhibit any commonality in terms of their psychological upbringing or culture or profile that would lead us to think that you can say this is non-veridical.
And you, as a real individual, will rely upon that more than all the other arguments from science or philosophy?
Yeah, I would. I think that the experience of God, for him who has it, is a self-authenticating experience. It's something that's so real that it overwhelms the defeaters which are brought against it.
What is the cosmological argument for the existence of God?
The cosmological argument is actually a family of arguments, different arguments, that all attempt to prove, on the basis of the existence of the world, that there is some sort of a first cause or sufficient reason for the existence of the world.
And what are some of the subsets of these arguments?
Well, for example, there's the so-called argument from contingency that has been defended by various philosophers such as Leibniz and others. And it would go something like this. Anything that exists has a reason or an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in some external cause. Now, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation would be God, a transcendent being beyond space and time. The universe is something that exists, obviously, and therefore it would follow that the universe has an explanation of its existence, and that explanation is God. That would be a kind of quick and easy summary of the basic premises of the contingency argument. And then one would need to talk about why one believes those premises to be true.
Are there some other cosmological arguments?
Yes. Another version would be the argument for a first temporal cause of the universe. And it's very simple. It would go like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And that would be an argument, again, for a transcendent creator of the universe.
And how have these arguments fared through their intellectual history?
Through their intellectual history, they've been defended by some of the greatest minds of the Western world. They fell into disfavor during the Enlightenment with the critiques of David Hume and Immanuel Kant. But during the 20th century, these arguments have resurfaced with enormous vigor, such that today, among the finest philosophers in the English-speaking world, you will find sophisticated defenders of all of these traditional arguments for God's existence. So we're really living at a time which is enjoying something of a renaissance of natural theology.
And with the cosmological argument, has some of the cosmological data from the world of science, the Hubble telescope, been helpful or contradictory?
Oh, it's been very helpful. You see, during the Middle Ages, when there was no scientific evidence, for example, for a beginning of the universe, philosophers presented purely philosophical arguments against the infinity of the past or an infinite regress of causes. But with the advent of modern astrophysical cosmology, it turns out that there is very good empirical evidence for the truth of the premise that the universe is not a necessarily existing being, but is contingent in a radical way, namely that it began to exist. So we have both philosophical arguments and scientific confirmation of the key premise of that second version of the cosmological argument.
Bill, does the idea of a multiverse, many different kinds of universes, innumerable universes, does that bother your theism?
No, it doesn't bother my theism at all. I think that God, as the infinite creator of all space and time, could create separate space-time manifolds or create a universe so vast that there would be different causally unconnected domains within one universe. So once you have an infinite transcendent creator, there's simply no problem with the scope of the space-time world that he brings into being.
How about in quantum mechanics? As you know, there is something called branching or differentiation, where at every Planck time, as they say, there's a branching of or differentiation of the world, so there's infinite numbers of us talking in different ways with very slight differences, and then you have a multiplicity of these quantum mechanical worlds.
That's one way in which theorists have thought to generate a world ensemble of universes, though I think that most quantum physicists would regard this as an extraordinarily implausible interpretation of quantum mechanics.
My question for you is, does that bother your theism, however you generate?
Oh, no, it wouldn't bother my theism at all, because God would still be the one who established the laws of quantum mechanics, who created the quantum vacuum and the space and time, the arena in which all these reactions take place. So, as I say, once you have a transcendent source of all space and time, matter and energy, then he's free to create any sort of physical reality he wants.
Cosmologists talk about a multiverse, innumerable universes. Do you think God created a multiverse?
I must confess, Robert, that I'm very skeptical of this metaphysical hypothesis. I think that if we were just one random member of a world ensemble of worlds or universes, that we would be observing a very different kind of universe than we in fact do.
What would that look like?
It should include all sorts of improbable and absurd events that don't happen, because in an infinite ensemble of worlds, if you can get events so improbable as the fine-tuning of the cosmological constant, the low entropy state, and so forth, then you should also get highly improbable events like a perpetual motion machine and rabbits wearing pink bow ties and so forth, because those are less improbable than the finely tuned constants and quantities.
Well, theoretically, those are occurring in other parts of this world ensemble.
But if...
Just not in ours.
Well, but if we are just a randomly ordered member of this ensemble, such that the probability is that somewhere these constants would be finely tuned, then things that are even less improbable ought also to be appearing conjointly. And yet we see a rationally ordered universe, and that cries out for some sort of explanation. In addition to that, a much smaller inflationary patch would be sufficient for our existence, rather than the large universe we see. And it is overwhelmingly more probable that if we were just a random member of a world ensemble, we should be observing a much smaller inflationary patch than what we do in fact observe. And I think this is really the Achilles heel in this multiverse hypothesis, that if we were just a member of a multiverse, randomly ordered, then it is overwhelmingly more probable we ought to be seeing a very different kind of universe than the rationally ordered world that we do in fact see.
Bill, what does it mean to say God created everything, the world, from nothing?
I think we can understand this concept more easily if we recall Aristotle's distinction between different types of causes. Aristotle said one type of cause is what he called an efficient cause. An efficient cause is a cause that produces the effect in being. It produces the effect in existence. An example of this would be Michelangelo being the efficient cause of the statue called the David. He is the one who sculpted, who made the David. In addition to efficient causes, Aristotle said there's also material causes, and this would be the stuff out of which the effect is made. So in this case, the material cause of the David would be the block of marble, which was brought from the quarry to Michelangelo to sculpt. So that when you ask about the cause of the David, you would say that Michelangelo is its efficient cause, but the marble block is the material cause. Now, with that distinction in mind, the doctrine of creation is the view that God is the efficient cause.
Made it happen.
Exactly. Of all reality exterior to himself, and that there is no material cause of that reality.
There was no pre-existing stuff.
Exactly. In other words, it's a rejection of any kind of metaphysical dualism, that originally there was God and some kind of other stuff
which God
over
fashioned.
Against God, yes, which he fashioned or shaped into a world. Rather, God is the efficient cause of the world and everything in it. All matter and energy, space and time themselves have been brought into being by God at a certain point in time. So the doctrine of creation, again, would be the doctrine that God has brought everything other than himself into being without any material cause.
So let's layer on this the latest thinking in cosmology, which brings everything back to a point in time, a small fraction of a second, 10 to the minus 40 something, who knows how small, incredibly small time period, an incredibly small space in which there is violent energy, extremely hot, energetic, from which everything later develops.
Yes.
Where do we get that from?
Well, on the Christian view, that initial singularity or initial space-time boundary is brought into being by God. And I think one of the most exciting
out of nothing.
Out of nothing, yes, without any material cause. And he is the cause of all the energy and mass in the universe and of space and time themselves, the framework in which matter and energy exist. And one of the most exciting developments of contemporary cosmology is that it has brought this doctrine of creation out of nothing into mainstream science and mainstream thinking. For centuries, the Judeo-Christian tradition held to the doctrine of creation out of nothing in the face of ancient Greek philosophy, modern Enlightenment naturalism, and modern materialism and idealism, all of which said that the universe is eternal and uncreated. And in the face of almost universal opposition, the Judeo-Christian tradition has held to the fact of creation out of nothing. And then dramatically, during the course of the 20th century, against all expectation, this prediction was verified by modern science, which has established rigorously that there is a past boundary to the universe before which literally nothing existed.
Now, there are two different views on that, other than what you're saying. From the theological point of view, there are some theologians who would say, even today, that there is no deep theological stake in the difference between a creation from nothing or God sort of sustaining eternally this eternal world. So let's deal with that first.
You're entirely correct about that, and I think that this represents, to be quite frank, a retreat on the part of certain theologians in the face of this sort of opposition from naturalism, materialism, and idealism that I spoke of a moment ago. I think that it is an attempt to shelter theology in a safe harbor of non-falsifiable, non-verifiable
So no matter what happens,
domains.
it can't be attacked.
Exactly. It's an attempt on the part of theologians to shelter theology in a safe harbor of non-verifiable, non-falsifiable assertions, which really renders theology utterly irrelevant to the world. And so I think it's quite a mistaken strategy to try to shelter theology in that way. And frankly, it doesn't need sheltering because, as I say, I think that the best evidence of contemporary cosmology is strongly confirmatory of the doctrine of creation.
Now, from the cosmologist's point of view, many would take the same data and not come to your conclusion. they would say that there is some inherent thing in the universe, some laws that caused that there's either an unending series of causes, or that first singularity kind of was rolled into existence by itself in some way, or some cosmic foam emerged, and each singularity is the product of this cosmic foam coming into existence, and suddenly one of them in an asymmetry explodes into a Big Bang, and this has been going on forever and ever. So each Big Bang that we see may look like it has a singularity, but in fact this has been going on forever and ever. We don't need any God.
Well, certainly those attempts have been made. But in one sense, the history of 20th century cosmology has been the history of one failed attempt after another to avert the absolute beginning predicted in the standard Big Bang model. We've seen the steady state model, we've seen oscillating models of the universe, we've seen vacuum fluctuation models, chaotic inflationary models, quantum gravity models, most recently the so-called ekpyrotic cyclical models of the universe, all of these attempting to avoid the absolute beginning predicted in the standard model. And one after another, these theories have either been falsified by the data or shown to be mathematically inconsistent, or else they have been shown to imply the very beginning of the universe that they sought to avoid. So I think that the prevailing view among contemporary cosmologists is that the universe cannot be eternal in the past, but that there is a past space-time boundary that represents the absolute beginning of the cosmos.
I think that some of those arguments would say, though, that you can't determine that this recent experience of a Big Bang is once you go beyond that, either a membrane, different dimensions, or some of these different theories could have oscillations before the Big Bang that we'd never have access to, and maybe that's non-falsifiable, but I don't think those are eliminated.
Well, you're alluding, I think, there to Paul Steinhardt and Neil Turok's so-called brain cosmology, which is an attempt to exploit string theory to develop an eternally oscillating universe in higher dimensions. And they tried to extend this infinitely into the past. But what was discovered in 2003, in the fall of that year, by three cosmologists, Alexander Vilenkin, Arvind Borde, and Alan Guth, the father of inflationary cosmology, through their theorem, they were able to demonstrate that even these models cannot be extended infinitely into the past, but that there has to be a past boundary at some point that represents the beginning of the universe. So even these brain cosmologies and higher dimensional cosmologies, which are really very metaphysical in character, have been shown to be non-infinitely extendable into the past. That is to say that they must have a past boundary. So while the case is by no means open and shut, I mean, the very nature of science is that its results are always provisional. They're always tentative. I think we can say with great confidence that the person who believes in the creation of the universe out of nothing stands solidly within mainstream science today. Minimally, we can say that. And that's quite different from the previous 2,000 years of speculation about the origin of the universe.
There is one statement, one verse, that speaks strongly to the subject of God's creation. We all know what that is. It's Genesis 1:1. And if I can remember my Hebrew, it's Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And the words mean, at least literally, beginning, create God, heavens and earth.
Yes.
Now that's the semantic meaning. Tell me what it really means.
All right. The expression hashemayim ve'et haaretz is an idiom in Hebrew for the whole universe.
The heavens and earth.
Exactly. It means the heavens and the earth. There is no word in Hebrew for the universe. So this is an idiom by which they would express the universe. So in effect, verse 1 says, in the beginning, God created the universe. And I think this speaks of the absolute creation of the universe by God that is investigated by modern cosmology. And then in the second verse, the focus dramatically narrows now, and it says, and the earth was without form and void. So the first verse speaks of God's creation of the cosmos, and then from verse 2 on, it's speaking of how God turns the earth from an uninhabitable wasteland into a habitable environment for man.
Now, you can read some modern translations which blur verse 1 and 2 together and make, I don't know, verse 1 something like an introduction to verse 2, like when God was doing all this stuff, and then the focus is on refashioning the earth itself. And so you lose, in that understanding, any sense of a creation.
You're correct that for some time, until at least recently, a number of biblical exegetes or scholars attempted to construe verse 1 as a subordinate clause. When God created the world in the beginning, the earth was without form and void, and so forth. But I think that this view has now been widely rejected and undermined on the basis of studies such as those by Klaus Westermann of the Hebrew of this passage. What he has been able to show is that when you have this grammatical construction in Hebrew, the material in the first passage, first clause, represents an independent, self-standing clause. And what follows in the second clause is something that is logically or temporally posterior to the first one. So that in fact this isn't a subordinate clause construction. It is a main clause followed by a conjunction. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then in Hebrew, it says, and the earth was without form and void. So that these represent two independent clauses conjoined by a conjunction.
In Hebrew, that conjunction often has a lot of power in terms of differentiating things. So what you're saying is that first verse stands alone as a giant pillar, as you will, holding up this concept, this theory of God as creator. And then we deal with the specifics of how he did it.
Yes, how he made the earth into a habitable environment. I think that's exactly right, Robert. The first verse, in a sense, stands outside of the typical ancient Near Eastern creation narratives, which would first describe a kind of situation and then how God intervened in that situation to change it. And it stands outside of that as a kind of preface or prefatory statement that the author has added to say that this represents an absolute beginning of creation, and then it goes on to describe how God went on to
Your point is an interesting one, because many people would say that the creation myth, using myth in an anthropological sense,
sure,
in Genesis is largely the same, if not derivative, of many other creation myths of the ancient Near East. Are you saying that verse 1 is qualitatively different than other creation myths?
Yes, I am. In these ancient Near Eastern creation myths, they typically have the form of saying, when such and such was the case, then God did blank. And you have this pattern in verse 2, that the earth was without form and void, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters, and then God said, let there be light, and so forth. What the author of Genesis does is prefix to this traditional mythical formula, verse 1, as an absolute and independent clause. In the beginning, God created the universe. And then comes your more typical formulaic mythical statement of how God took a situation and transformed it into something else.
You are saying that Genesis 1:1 is then utterly unique in Middle Eastern creation myths.
That's exactly right. In ancient Near Eastern creation stories, you typically have a formula that begins, when such and such was the case, then God did blank. And that's what you have, for example, beginning in verse 2 of Genesis. When the earth was without form and void, then God said, let there be light, and so forth. And what the author of Genesis did was to take this traditional ancient Near Eastern mythical formulation and prefix it with verse 1 as an absolute independent statement. In the beginning, God created the universe. And then describes the transformation of that. So it is a dramatic way of differentiating Israel's belief about God and the creation of the world from all of its ancient Near Eastern neighbors.
I can understand how God creates concrete objects, things. But what is interesting to me, maybe more interesting, are abstract notions, necessary truths of logic, mathematics, 2 + 2 = 4, things that seem to be true no matter what and almost impossible to create because they are necessary abstract things. Help me to understand this.
Well, I think you put your finger here on one of the oldest and most arcane metaphysical disputes among philosophers that there is, and that is whether or not there is a realm of abstract entities in addition to the concrete entities that we all know and love. On the one hand, it's difficult even to know what an abstract object is. We're familiar with concrete objects, things that exist in space and time, but abstract objects would be something quite different than that. They don't have spatiotemporal relations with things in most cases. So,
what are some examples?
Well, examples would be things like the number 3, for example. Do you think that there is a thing called 3? That 3 actually exists? And I'm not talking about the numeral 3, which is a mark on a piece of paper. That clearly exists.
There are a lot of examples, exemplification of this concept.
Yes.
A lot of particulars.
Yes, a lot of particulars. And these we would typically call numerals. But does the number 3 exist? Is there something called 3 that is a part of reality? And are there other numbers? And are there sets of numbers and functions and other mathematical entities?
Logical relationships.
These things would typically stand in logical relationships. For example, 3 is the square root of 9. And that would seem to be a necessary relationship in which these abstract objects, if they exist, stand. So the question is, are there such things as these abstract objects? And what are they if they exist? Typically, the realm of abstract objects would be defined as objects which do not stand in any causal relations with anything else. The number 3, if it exists, doesn't cause anything. It has no causal effect on any other thing. If these abstract objects exist, they would be causally effete or impotent. And that would seem to be definitive of what an abstract object is. Anything that does not or cannot stand in a causal relationship would be an abstract object if it exists.
How does this help me understand whether God created it or didn't?
Well, in this way, many of these abstract objects, if they exist, would seem to exist necessarily. The number 3 doesn't seem to be a contingent object. It would seem to be necessary in its being.
And that God, if God didn't create it, it would still have to be.
Exactly.
And you couldn't go from God creating 2 and then 4 and just never created 3.
Well, not if you're what is called a Platonist. A Platonist is named after the Greek philosopher Plato, who believed in a realm of forms or abstract objects like this. And Platonists would say that numbers are not created by human beings thinking of them in our minds, but that numbers exist necessarily, and so do sets and other mathematical objects. Now, it seems to me that that kind of Platonism is inherently incompatible with the Judeo-Christian faith, which conceives of God as the creator of all reality outside of himself.
So that means if you have these abstract objects, numbers, existing necessarily, meaning that God didn't create them, that is detrimental to the fundamental concept of the Judeo-Christian God?
Right. It would be incompatible with the Judeo-Christian concept of God, which thinks of God as uniquely self-existent. God is the only self-existent being.
So now if we have something else that's self-existent, then God is just one of an innumerable number of abstract or something things, and just God is part of this panoply.
You said it exactly right. It would literally be innumerable. Infinities of infinities of infinities.
Of things.
Of things that exist all independently of God, so that it leads to a kind of metaphysical pluralism that reduces God to an infinitesimal part of reality,
Just
most of which is totally independent of Him.
So all God would be doing is creating the concrete objects, which is a tiny fraction of all these other things.
Just an infinitesimal part of reality would be due to God's creative activity. Most realms of being would exist necessarily and independently of God, which compromises both God's self-existence and also His creation of everything else out of nothing. It would mean, in fact, that most things are not created.
And also His freedom, because then He hasn't been free to create or not create these.
Well, I think that does seem to follow, because it would mean God is not free to refrain from creation and simply exist alone. It would mean that God necessarily has lots of company out there.
And God Himself would be just one of this innumerable number of things that exist forever and necessarily.
Right, He would just be one among many, and there wouldn't be any ultimate unifying metaphysical source of reality.
So, as a Christian theist, you got a problem.
Right.
What do you do about it?
Well, I remember when I first encountered this issue, it struck me deeply. I thought, this is a dagger at the heart of my faith in God. This is a serious objection that I had never encountered before. And so I began to read and study on this area, and it seems to me that there are three possible responses that the Christian or Jewish monotheist might make to this problem. The simplest and most obvious would be a sort of absolute creationism, which would try to marry Platonism with traditional theism and creation by saying, well, these things don't exist necessarily after all. They are created by God. God created all of the numbers and the abstract objects and so forth.
And yet, for us, it's hard to believe how you can have existence without them.
Yes, now,
they seem indispensable.
That's true, although there are some purely secular philosophers who believe that numbers, if they exist contingently. And one could say that they exist eternally, but that they are eternally created by God in the sense of conserved in being by God. There, the doctrine of conservation might come into play. You could say God never brought the numbers into being, but nevertheless they depend on Him for their existence, a kind of absolute creationism. You could finesse this different ways, but the basic insight would be to try to preserve the reality of these objects external to God, but make them created entities. That would be
so that's
absolute creationism. Right. Now, an alternative view would be what's called fictionalism, which would say that, in fact, there aren't any such entities as these abstract objects. These are just useful fictions that we use to organize the world. But, in fact, there really is no such thing as the number 3.
So it's a human imposition on the world?
Well, it would be a way of speaking about the world that is convenient, but shouldn't be construed literally. So, for example, when I say something like this, there are differences between Republicans and Democrats, I don't mean to be committing myself to the existence of something called differences, which exist out in the world, that there are really things that we call differences. When I say there are differences between Republicans and Democrats, I don't mean to be committing myself to some object called differences. What I mean could be paraphrased away by saying Republicans and Democrats differ. And you see, that paraphrase then would reveal I'm not committing myself to this new ontological category called differences. And in the same way, one might say mathematical talk and talk of other abstract objects is just a way of talking about the real world of concrete objects, and it's not meant to be construed literally. This is just useful fiction.
And therefore it's not a problem.
And therefore it's not a problem, because these things don't really exist.
Okay. What's the third?
The third way would be what is called conceptualism. And this would be to move the realm of abstract objects out of the external world into God's mind as ideas or concepts of God. This was St. Augustine's move. He was trained in Platonic thought, but realized that this realm of independently existing abstract objects was incompatible with theism, so he moved them into the mind of God. He said the Platonic realm of the forms or the ideas are God's ideas. And so numbers are concepts in God's mind, and properties would be concepts that God has. Propositions might be God's thoughts that are either true or false. So conceptualism would say there is no realm of external abstract objects, but nevertheless they're not just fictions. They do exist, but they exist as ideas in God's mind. So these would be three alternatives, and I think the question is which of these alternatives provides the best account of God and abstract objects.
And they are very different. Do you find it a critical question for a Christian theist?
Well, I think this question is absolutely critical, Robert. As I said, I think that it's incompatible with the traditional Judeo-Christian faith to have this Platonistic view of reality. And yet many philosophers and many mathematicians today are Platonists about these mathematical and other abstract structures. And so I think that this is just imperative that we think through this very difficult subject in a deep way and come to some sort of resolution. And I think these are the three broad alternatives that are out there for us to explore.
And your conclusion, using any one of those three, is that God is the ultimate creator and and his existence is different than the existence of these objects.
Yes, each of the three would provide a theologically acceptable way of discussing abstract objects that would leave God as uniquely self-existent and the creator of all reality outside himself.
One of the most perplexing things about reality is what seems obvious: time. We've all wondered about it. But when you think about time and then you think about God, then the two together really cause complexity.
Yes.
How do you deal with God and time?
I remember one philosopher who said that if the philosophical importance of a topic can be judged by the amount of nonsense written about it, then the concept of time comes somewhat ahead of the concept of space and somewhat behind the concept of God.
Right.
And you put God and time together, you have a subject that
volatile,
is truly baffling and mind-expanding, one of the deepest. I spent 13 years working on this topic as my major research interest, and it's an inexhaustible study.
All right, 13 years worth. Tell me what you learned.
Well, I think we need to talk about the nature of time most fundamentally. I think that this is the question. And philosophers have distinguished two radically different concepts of time that will profoundly affect how you view reality and I think how you view God's relationship to time.
Okay, what are they?
One view of time is what we might call a dynamic theory of time, or a tensed theory of time. And what it says is that time is, the moments of time are ordered by past, present, and future, and that these are real and objective aspects of reality. The past is gone. It no longer exists. The present is real. The future has not yet come to be and is not real. And so the future is not sort of out there ahead of us down the line waiting for us to arrive. The future is pure potentiality. Only the present is real. And so things in time come to be and pass away. There is real, objective, temporal becoming in the world as things come into existence and then pass out of existence. That's the dynamic process or tensed theory of time.
Tensed meaning that there are verbs which have past tenses and present tenses and future tense.
Yes, and that those tenses express objective features of reality. That's the key.
Now, sometimes you call this the A theory.
That's right. That comes from the British idealist J.M.E. McTaggart, who distinguished these two theories, I think, first of all among thinkers, and called one the A theory and the B theory. Not too descriptive, but a convenient label.
The A is the dynamic one.
That's
the
right.
one that I would say is the common perception.
I think it is the perception of the common man. It's the common sense view.
It's a little hard to discern what is the present because we're moving through the present. I don't know how long the present lasts.
That's right, yes.
That's a little difficult.
That's a difficult question.
But let's say now we have the dynamic theory, theory A, past doesn't exist, future is a potentiality. Now, what's the B theory?
The B theory, or the static theory, or the tenseless theory of time, says that the difference between past, present, and future is just an illusion of human consciousness. That in fact, all moments of time are equally real and existent. The future is as real as the present, is as real as the past. So for the people in 1868 is real, and we are in the future. For the people in 2050, we are in the past, and the present for them is real. But all of those are just subjective standpoints of those observers. In fact, if you could stand back and see things from a sort of God's eye point of view, all moments in time are equally real, and temporal becoming is just a subjective psychological feature of human consciousness, not a real feature of the world.
Moving in this path.
That movement, that sense of movement, is a purely subjective illusion of consciousness.
Because each place in this four-dimensional space-time block is equally real.
That's correct, and that is one way to conceive of it, is that the universe is a four-dimensional reality, not a three-dimensional reality which elapses or goes through time. Really, things are extended in four dimensions, and the whole space-time block, that whole four-dimensional block, just exists timelessly. And this point of view, though very counter to the common sense view of time, is very prevalent among physicists and people in the scientific community and certain philosophers as well.
Why is that?
Well, I think the main reason is that thinking of reality in four-dimensional terms makes the special and general theories of relativity very easy to grasp. It's easy to make a space-time diagram on a piece of paper in which the horizontal dimension represents space and the vertical dimension represents time, and you can represent the whole process there on a diagram which depicts space-time. And I think many scientists interpret the diagrams as literal representations of reality, that reality really is a four-dimensional space-time block.
Because the interpretation is that absolute space and absolute time have been shown to be erroneous by Einstein.
I think that that is one of the major motivations behind the adoption of this B theory or tenseless theory of time, is the belief that the A theory or tense theory is incompatible with special relativity. Now, in fact, I don't think that that is true at all. I think it's completely compatible with special relativity. But I'm sure you're right that this is one of the major motivations for adopting this four-dimensional view.
Let's try to understand the B theory, the tense-less theory of time, because that's the one that's certainly counterintuitive to our normal way of thinking. What does that mean, tenseless? How do I deal with the fact that my children were born sometime in the past, and I can't use a tense to describe that? Is there a sequence of events?
Yes, sequence is still real in the sense that the events in time are related as earlier and later than each other. And that is a real and objective relation. But what the tenseless theorists deny is that things are really and objectively past, present, and future.
So they can order things in an earlier or later sense, but they don't put a past tense on it as if it once existed and now does not.
That's correct. Your birth is always earlier than your death, whether they lie in the future, whether one is in the present, or whether both in the past. Your birth is always earlier than your death. But you see here, the word earlier has been robbed of all tense. There's no sense in which that which is earlier is past. It is a relationship which is akin to the less than and greater than relationship that stands among numbers.
By saying robbed, you're showing your own prejudice,
yes,
I think.
That is an emotional
Others may
term.
say you strip out the artificiality that a human mind has injected into it.
Absolutely, that is what they would say. And that they would say that there is no mind-independent becoming or presentness of reality. So it's a radically different interpretation of the world than the common sense view.
I am fascinated by God's personal relationship, if there's a God, with time. Not just what time is, but God's personal. Does God have a history? Why didn't God create the world sooner? Is God going to get bored just living forever? I mean, there's so much happening when you think about God and time.
Yes, I think it's a fascinating topic. Ever since I became a Christian, I've been baffled and intrigued by God's relationship to time. One of the most difficult questions, I think, is if God is timeless, then how could he be active in the temporal world? And particularly, how could he become incarnate in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, the way Christians believed? The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard said that this is the absurd, that the eternal and the timeless should enter into history. Well, I had a flirtation with Kierkegaardian existentialism for a while, but my mind couldn't rest in that. And so I thought there has to be a rational explanation of God's relationship to time. And so this has been one of the major foci of my research.
What are some of the implications, without discussing what God is, but what are the implications of it?
Well, one question would be, as you say, the personhood of God. Does it make sense to talk about a timeless person? And if so, how should we conceive the life of God? Another question would be whether or not God is able to be active in the world, or is he so removed from it that he doesn't really get involved in our temporal lives if he's timeless? Another question would be whether or not time would affect God's life. Does God have all the life that he has in a timeless moment, or is God's life distributed over time the way ours is? Does God have a future, so to speak?
Well, and that would mean that if God had a past, there are things to God that no longer are real.
That would
they may be a
correct.
memory, they may be a perfect memory. In every respect, God's memory is better than mine. It wouldn't take much. But they're no longer real. God's lost it.
Yes, that's right. And on the other hand, if you think about the evils and the atrocities that have existed in human history, if there isn't a passage of time that is real, then that means, in a sense, those things still exist. They're still equally real, and evil is never really overcome on this view of reality that says things are timelessly or tenselessly existing.
So do we have a bimodal choice, one or the other? Either God is in time or God is outside time.
I do think that it is a choice of that sort, Robert, because these are contradictories. To be in time is to have a temporal location and a temporal extension. And to be timeless is simply to have no temporal location or extension. So these are contradictories. They cannot both be true. So you've got to choose between timelessness and temporality.
And there's no other possibility.
The only other way you could put them together would be to qualify these in some way. For example, we can say that something can be both black and not black if it's black at one time but not black at a later time. Or maybe it's black on one side but not black on the other side. You've got to qualify it. So if you want to say God is both timeless and temporal, you've got to qualify it some way, or that's just a blanket contradiction that cannot be true.
Yeah. Now, what are the implications? If God were timeless, does that mean there's no sequence of events?
Well, I am persuaded that the timelessness or temporality of God will stand or fall on which view you adopt of the nature of time itself. I think that how you view God's relationship to time will depend upon what you think time is like. And philosophers have distinguished two very different views of time. One is a dynamic view of time that says that past, present, and future are objective, and that the past is gone, the future is merely potential, only the present is real. The other view of time says that all moments and events in time are equally real, and temporal becoming is just an illusion of human consciousness. Now, those are very different views of time, and I think that how you conceive of time will radically and fundamentally determine how you view God's eternity and his relationship to time.
Does that make God dependent upon the nature of time?
No, I think it would merely mean that if God has chosen to create a tensed universe, if he has chosen to create a tensed time or a
with a
dynamic
past
time,
that's no longer here and a future yet to come,
then that will affect how he exists as well. Whereas if there is a tenseless reality, this sort of static view of reality, then that will not affect God in his eternity. In other words, what I would want to say is that if you want to have a timeless view of God, where God is absolutely timeless, then I think you need to go with this tenseless view that sees time as just a part of a four-dimensional block, just an internal dimension of this four-dimensional space-time block, and God exists outside the block, and he sustains the block in being.
and can see or interact with any point in this block.
Exactly.
And any point in this block has a time component to it.
That's right. And God exists outside the block of space-time, and therefore timelessly, and sustains tenseless causal relations to everything that's in the block.
Does that mean, though, in God's own internal mental life, if we can say that, that there are no sequence of events, nothing before or after in God's own internal?
That would imply that. A timeless God would be a God who experiences no past, present, and future, no earlier and later. He would know of things in the block that they are earlier and later than each other. But for God, the whole block would just be there in a single timeless moment, as it were.
And how does God then process? We think of processes has to be sequences, and sequences seem to have to be in time. So it would seem like God is like a granite block.
Well, I think that's correct. On this view of time, everything is static. Change just means that earlier points in the block are different from later points in the block. But they're both equally real. The change in time on this view is no different than, say, the change in space from one point in space to another. There is no process on this view.
I'm trying to get at God's own life. I see the block, and the
Okay.
block is everything God created. God created that
Right.
block because God created everything according to your view. So God created this four-dimensional block in this timeless view of God. But my struggle is, what does that mean for God's own internal mental life?
It would mean that God has a single state of consciousness that never changes. He just knows all tenseless truths about himself, reality, the block, and nothing ever changes.
All in this one tenseless moment.
Yes.
It's
And so it is, as you say, kind of frozen. It's everything is just sort of frozen in timelessness.
Now, what do we know from that? Is there some benefits to that? I mean, in one sense, you...
Well, very few, I think. I don't accept this view of reality. But benefits, it would enable you to explain very easily how God knows the future. Because
You just
what is future for us,
see a point.
yeah, it's already out there, so he just looks and sees it, so to speak. So it would be very easy to explain how God knows the future on this view. But apart from that, I think that this view is just filled with philosophical and theological problems that render it implausible.
One of the arguments for it is that if God is in time, God is losing experience. There's things that will have happened that are forever lost.
Yes. Well, let's talk about the other view, because we haven't really spoken of it. If you have a dynamic theory of time where things are coming into being and passing away, then God, as the creator and sustainer of the world, must bring things into being and sustain them in being as long as they exist, and then they pass out of being. So God himself would be in process and would be constantly creatively active in bringing things into being. And he would also know things as they come to be and pass away. So his knowledge would constantly be changing. He would know, I am now delivering Israel out of Egypt. I am now parting the Red Sea. I am now bringing them into the Promised Land, for example.
Okay, if God is in time and continuing to create, continuing to improve, because God is good to do those kinds of things, doesn't that mean that there's an imperfection here, that if God is getting better, that means at some point he was not as good as he could be?
Well, I wouldn't agree that being in time implies that God is continuing to improve. Something can be at absolute perfection and change, not, so to speak, vertically on the scale of perfection, but change horizontally in being in different states of perfection. So, for example, suppose God knows at one moment it's 3 o'clock, and at the next moment he knows it's 3:01. I don't think that change is any improvement in God whatsoever, nor does it show that God was imperfect when he knew it was 3 o'clock instead of 3:01. On the contrary, it's a mark of his perfection that he always knows accurately what time it is. So I would see any changes in God that transpire as a result of being in time as not being improvements or growing in perfection, but it would be an expression of his cognitive perfection, that he would always know the tensed truths that are true at any time, and therefore would always know what time it is, and he would never believe any false propositions.
How about the argument that asks, why did God wait so long to create the universe? Because if God is in time, that meant he existed forever and ever and ever in the past, and he just waited for an infinite long period and then created. Why didn't he do it sooner so you and I could have had this conversation earlier?
This is a question that Leibniz pressed against Newton and his followers like Samuel Clarke. And I think that it is a sound argument against thinking that God has endured through an infinite sequence of temporal moments prior to the moment of creation. I think that that argument does show that that's impossible. And so what that implies, I think, is that time must have had a beginning, and that in some mysterious way God existed not before time, that would be a self-contradiction, but he existed in some way beyond time. And so the way I would put it is this, is that God is timeless without creation, and he is temporal since the moment of creation. So the decision to create on God's part is a decision to enter into time, to take on a temporal mode of existence in order to relate to his creatures.
That almost sounds like God is changing his internal characteristics.
Well, it depends on whether or not you think that God's temporal status is essential to the nature of God. And I don't think that we should say that. I think that it is essential to God to be eternal. And by that we mean he is without beginning or end. He neither came into existence nor will he go out of existence. So everyone can agree that God is eternal. But the question is he eternal in the sense of existing throughout infinite time? Or is he eternal in the sense of just being timeless and therefore having no beginning or end? And what I want to suggest is that God's mode of existence is a contingent property of God dependent upon his will. If God chooses to remain changeless and alone and never create, then he will exist timelessly. But if he chooses to create a world, then he will exist temporally. So I think that it makes sense to say that God is eternal in the sense of having neither beginning nor end. He is permanent.
Nobody argues that one.
Right. So that is an essential property of God, but it's up to God whether or not he exists timelessly and eternally or temporally and eternally.
So can he change his mind and go back?
Now that's a really profound question. Could God, say, annihilate the universe and annihilate the world and resume a state of timelessness? I don't think so. And the reason is
that he doesn't want to, or it's impossible?
That it would be impossible.
You think it's impossible for God to do that?
I think so, because I think that, given the nature of time, that if God were to annihilate the world, it would always make sense to say
that
God did, the world did exist. He did annihilate it. And he no longer exists with a world. So once time comes into being, that fact is always a temporal fact, even if God annihilates everything and goes back to a state of changelessness.
So that was a big decision he made.
Yeah.
I mean, because that got him into time, and we're saying once he was in time, he was locked there forever.
Well, the word locked, again, is an emotionally loaded term. I mean, in one sense, as we were talking about a moment ago, you can be locked in timelessness, like a frozen mannequin, unable to do anything, to respond to anything. In one sense, God liberates his activity and relationships by entering into time so that he can interact with his created world of temporal persons.
One can argue either way, which is better. You have a good argument. But what I'm saying is once that decision was made, it's irrevocable.
I think that's right. But of course, God does that with full knowledge. I think it is part of the condescension of God, frankly, Robert, that God, out of his love for us and his desire to relate to us, would quit this state of eternal, timeless perfection that he enjoyed and take on our temporal mode of existence in order to sustain relationships with us.
You are then limiting God, because God is now in a state from which he cannot remove himself. He is in time and forever thereafter has to be.
It's no more limitation on God's power than his inability to create a square circle or a married bachelor. These are logical impossibilities, and being omnipotent doesn't mean the ability to do the logically impossible.
Sure, but God could have never made it a married bachelor or square.
And he could have never created time or the universe and entered into it. So, again, if you think of it as a limitation,
once he did that,
it's
he
a
was then
self-limitation. Right. And once he's done it, I think that he will remain always in time. But that is no more an infringement of God's ability than, as I say, doing some other logical impossibility, like making a square circle or something of that sort.
But this is a conscious decision on God's part to do something from which he cannot emerge, whereas as squaring a circle or a married bachelor is something he never could have done. Because that's
right. That's right. I mean, he could have never created a bachelor at all, but it lies completely beyond God's power to create a married bachelor or a square circle. These are logical impossibilities. And in the same way, it's logically impossible to bring it about that the past which existed has not existed.
Right.
That's as much a self-contradiction as a square circle.
I agree, but God makes that conscious decision to put himself in that condition.
Yes, that's right. And so
he does it because of this desire to develop relationship with his created creatures.
Yes, I think that's right. It would be similar to his giving free will to creatures. God limits himself in such a way that he creates persons who are able to rebel against him and do things that are contrary to his will, that are beyond his control, because it's logically impossible to make someone freely do something. So I don't think there's any problem in thinking that God enters into situations in which he doesn't control everything.
One of the characteristics of the traditional Judeo-Christian God is that he knows the future. That seems to us, normal, mortal people, as impossible. Is it impossible?
No, I don't think that's at all impossible, and I think there are a variety of models that one could use to explain how God knows the future.
What are some examples?
Well, one way to do it very easily would be if you adopted a theory of time according to which all events in time are equally real, that the difference between past, present, and future is merely an illusion of human consciousness. On this sort of view of reality, the future is as real as the past, and they all exist equally robustly and are therefore available for God to know. So if God simply exists outside this space-time manifold, he can see, in a metaphorical way, everything that transpires in the manifold. So if you adopt this view of reality as a four-dimensional space-time block, foreknowledge is very, very easy to explain.
Suppose, though, God is not outside of time, but exists in time with us. Then how does he see the future?
Well, that's a very interesting way of putting the question. How does he see the future, you said? And I think, Robert, that betrays a presupposition that God's knowledge is akin or analogous to perceptual knowledge. And on this view, we think of God's knowledge of the future as some sort of foresight, that he looks ahead and sees what's going to happen, and that's how he knows it. And this kind of perceptual approach to God's knowledge, I think, does run into real problems if you have a view of time according to which temporal becoming is a real and objective feature of reality.
Because it hasn't happened yet.
Because there is no reality to look ahead and see. But I think that construing God's foreknowledge on the model of perception is just completely wrong. When you think about God, that's terribly anthropomorphic in any case. God's knowledge of mathematical truths or ethical truths isn't based on anything like perception. Rather, I would adopt what we could call a conceptualist model of God's foreknowledge rather than a perceptualist model. A conceptualist model of God's foreknowledge would be more on the analogy of innate ideas. Persons like Plato, for example, thought that we have innate knowledge of certain truths, and that education is not really acquiring or learning new truths, but simply bringing to consciousness this innate knowledge that we already have. Now, while that may not be a very plausible knowledge or plausible model for human knowledge, I think it's entirely plausible in the case of God, that God has innately the essential property of knowing only and all true propositions. And so the way he knows the future is not by looking ahead and seeing what's going to happen. It's simply by knowing the truth value of all propositions. He knows which are true and which are false. That includes future tense statements. And so by knowing the truth value of future tense statements, God knows what's going to happen.
It sounds like that is philosophical meanderings.
Oh, really?
And rather than... But are those events real? They're not real.
No, they're not. But the idea that they have to be real in order to be known is based upon this assumption of a perceptualist model of divine cognition. And that's, as I say, very anthropomorphic, to think of God as sort of up there looking down and seeing what's going to happen. Rather, God as an unembodied mind doesn't really have anything like perceptions because he has no sense organs when you think about it. So God's knowledge is more like the knowledge of an innate, infinite mind which has the essential property of knowing only and all true propositions.
What does that mean, though, if God knows innately something that I may or may not do in the future?
What that means is that one of those statements is true. Either you will eat pizza tomorrow for lunch or you will not eat pizza tomorrow for lunch. One of those statements is true and one is false because they're contradictories.
Right.
And God has the essential property of knowing which of those is true and which is false. He knows the truth value of all propositions. And if you are enamored with this perceptualist model of perception,
you go back to the other.
Well, no. What I'll say in that case is that propositions exist in the present, and so God can just look at the proposition and see what its truth value is. In the same way that He can look at a dog and see what color the dog is. It has the property of being brown rather than the property of being white. God can look at these propositions and see which ones have the value true and which have the value false. So
in the present.
Yeah, in the present, because there are presently future tense propositions, past tense propositions. God can look at them and see their truth value.
So
now, I think that's completely misconceived. As I say, His knowledge isn't like perception, but for those who are wedded to this idea of perception, they seem to have forgotten about these propositions that exist that God could look at and inspect.
But does that mean that in the theory of time that past, present, and future are all real, God could perceive everything, but in the theory that time is a becoming and the past is over and the future has not yet come, that God then has to know the future through some innate mechanism?
I think that the analogy of perception works on the tenseless view of time, where everything is equally real. But that analogy of perception is flawed when it comes to the view of time as dynamic.
Bill, as I think of God, and I think of God's omniscience, and I think of my own life, I feel that I'm in control of what I can ask you. I can ask you one question or another question. But traditional theology said God has absolutely determined the future or settled. Everything is settled. Is my ability to ask you one question or another settled in God's mind?
Well, I think that really depends, Robert, on what you mean by settled. And different theologians have different views of exactly what that means. For example, there are those who would follow John Calvin and Augustine in thinking that God's foreknowledge is based on His foreordination, that because God has decreed that everything that happens will come to pass, therefore He foreknows it, so that His foreknowledge is based upon His predestination of everything that happens. And that would remove, I think, significant human freedom.
So God knows that I'm going to do something basically because He made it such that I would.
That's correct. He's determined it.
Okay, that's one possibility.
That's one possibility. Another possibility, perhaps the other extreme, would be to say that God doesn't know the future and doesn't determine it, and therefore He gambles in creating human beings with free will because He doesn't know how they're going to react, and God takes risks. He knows probabilities, but He doesn't know what's going to happen, and He rolls the dice, so to speak, and hopes that things turn out for the best, and He works Himself to try to make them turn out for the best.
The future is open.
Yes, not only is the future open on this view, but there aren't even any truths about the future that can be known by God, and God doesn't in any way abridge human freedom or control human beings. And as I say, He just doesn't have any knowledge of what's going to happen apart from what He could infer from present causes that exist, in the same way that you and I have a degree of foreknowledge of what's going to happen in the immediate future from present causes. But the farther you get into the future, the less you know. And similarly with God, He really doesn't know how it's going to turn out on this open view. So that would be the far extreme from the other end.
It sounds more exciting to me, not knowing what's going to happen.
Well, remember that in the quest for truth, we have to be very careful that we don't pick what appeals to us as what we think to be true. And I do think this is a real problem in this area. People want to create a God who is appealing to them, and therefore they tailor image their God to fit what they find exciting.
All right, so we've defined two boundary conditions.
Yes.
We've defined the preordination, where God knows the future because He's preordained it. Basically, He's making it happen.
Right.
The other boundary condition is that God, the future is open, God really does not know in detail or anything what's going to happen. He has some probabilities.
And notice that these are actually rather close to each other. It's not like they're two different ends of a line. They're more like a circle that come back around because they're actually very close to each other. Both of these views agree that the only way God could know the future is if he determines it.
Right.
And so there's actually a rather common assumption behind both of these views.
And that's a free will kind of question. So in both cases, they both recognize the fact that if God predetermines something, basically that's the way he knows it.
Yes, that's correct. And so when those who hold to this openness view are confronted with examples of God's foreknowledge of the future, you find they collapse back into the foreordination view. They say, well, not everything is free. Some things are predetermined by God. Well, any biblical Christian then is left with the view that Peter was determined by God to deny Christ, that poor Judas was determined by God to betray Jesus, which certainly ought to leave one feeling very uncomfortable, but that these people were determined by God to do sinful acts. It makes God the author of evil.
Not only them, but everybody who sinned.
Well, not everybody, because remember, some views on the openness view, God doesn't know a lot of this.
Sure, on the
but
predetermined
with respect to the Judas and the Peter example, you see in Scripture, Jesus predicts that these events are going to happen. He knows they're going to happen. And so the openness people, because they say the only way you can know the future is if it's determined, have to say God determined that Judas would betray Jesus and Peter betray Christ. So they're really bedfellows with these determinists because they both agree the only way God can foreknow the future is by determining it himself.
All right, now what's in the middle?
What's in the middle are a couple of different views. One would be the simple foreknowledge view, which would say that God doesn't determine the future. There is genuine free will of human beings, but that God knows what will happen in advance. So that God's knowledge, though chronologically prior to the event, is logically posterior to the event. God's knowledge doesn't determine the event. It's the event that determines what God foreknows. So on this model, God's knowledge of the future is rather like an infallible barometer of the weather. The barometer will always be right because it's infallible, but the barometer doesn't determine the weather. Whichever way the weather would be is what the barometer would indicate.
It sounds like reverse causation, or causation in a backward direction.
Now, that's a very perceptive remark because I think it does have the same sort of effects or implications as backward causation. And it's very interesting that in scientific literature, quite apart from these debates in theology, there are debates about backward causation, time travel, relativity theory, and so forth, that arrive at similar conclusions, that just because something is in the future doesn't mean that it is determined by what happens in the present. Rather, the way the present is could be because these things will go differently in the future. Now, in the case of foreknowledge, I don't think it's a causal relationship. It's not like our choices cause God to believe something, but it is rather that our choices determine how certain propositions are true or false, and God, being omniscient, knows only in all true propositions, and so, in that sense, his knowledge is logically posterior to our actions.
The difference between the simple foreknowledge and the preordained foreknowledge is that in the preordained case, God is making it happen. In the simple foreknowledge case, he's just perceiving it in some way.
That's correct. In the simple foreknowledge case, there's genuine human freedom, and God simply knows how agents will freely choose, and if they were to choose differently, then he would have different foreknowledge.
But in both cases, it's 100% absolute, no exceptions.
Right.
God knows, end of story.
Right. But the one is consistent with the ability to do otherwise, and the other one isn't.
Yes. Okay. Anything else?
Well, there's a fourth view that we haven't talked about, and that's the view called middle knowledge. And it adds a sort of extra explanatory dimension to the simple foreknowledge view by explaining how God has knowledge of the future with respect to free actions. And what it holds is that prior to God's decision to create the world, God knows how any free creature would freely choose in any circumstances God might place him in. So by choosing to create certain circumstances and put certain creatures in them, God's foreknowledge comes as a result. He knows exactly then how that creature will behave because he knew what that creature would do if he were in those circumstances. So this gives God foreknowledge of the future on the basis of his knowledge of how persons would freely choose in any circumstances they might be placed in.
That seems to give a slightly bigger opening for free will.
Well, I don't think so, Robert. I think both of them are entirely consistent with human free will.
Both of them, the simple foreknowledge and
the middle knowledge. But what the middle knowledge approach does offer is an explanation of God's providential control over human history without abridging human freedom. It shows how it is that God can plan a universe which will ultimately arrive at his ends through the free decisions of creatures. In opposition to that, the simple foreknowledge view has the rather odd consequence that God must be totally surprised, in a sense, at the way things turn out. He knows the way they will turn out, but that's not a result of his planning it, because there isn't any logically prior moment at which he says, here's the way everyone would behave in all these different circumstances, so I'm going to create these circumstances, put these people in them, and that way I know what's going to happen. Instead, he just sort of wakes up, as it were, and finds himself with knowledge of the future and of the way everything will be, but there isn't any account of how he got this sort of knowledge and of his providence over human history.
Now, that makes it sound like there's less free will, in a sense, in that argument.
In which one?
In the middle knowledge argument, because then God is choosing a world in which he knows what would happen, and so that seems to constrain human free will more than in the simple foreknowledge if he just wakes up and knows what's happening.
I think that what you're discerning is that this is truly a mediating position between the extremes. The determinists say this allows too much human freedom because God doesn't determine how the persons will act in these circumstances. The open theists say this is too deterministic because God is the one who chooses which world it is. And I find myself comfortably in the middle between the two, saying that it affirms both divine sovereignty and human freedom. One defender of this middle knowledge point of view put it in this way, it sounds paradoxical, but I think so nicely captures it. He says, it is up to God whether we find ourselves in a world in which we are predestined, but it is up to us whether we are predestined in the world in which we find ourselves.
Bill, I'm not sure whether I believe in God, but if I do, understanding God's characteristics to me is very important. And one of the most interesting ones is that God is, this word omniscient, knowing everything.
Right.
What does that mean?
Traditionally, a person is omniscient if for any proposition, P, that person knows that P and does not believe not P. In other words,
P meaning any
proposition,
any statement of fact. Or
right, exactly. So that an omniscient person would be someone who knows only and all truths.
Okay, now what is truth? I mean, what kinds of truth? Are there truths that exist and truths that don't exist, or possible truths?
Well, that's why I defined it in terms of propositions. Proposition is the information content of a declarative sentence. Take any declarative sentence, it expresses a certain information content. And the idea of omniscience is that there is no fact of the matter, there is no true information that this person does not know, and he believes no false proposition. So he would know only and all facts.
But there are more things in the world than just pure facts.
Well, that is a very interesting point. I think you're right about that. There is another type of knowledge that we could call non-propositional knowledge. And this would be knowledge, for example, how to ride a bicycle, or how a watermelon tastes, or things of that sort. But omniscience isn't typically defined
How
in
it feels to have an interview together.
That's right. Or, for example, how it feels to be a sinner. And clearly God couldn't have that kind of...
You and I have never had that feeling.
Well, I certainly have, but God wouldn't have that sort of feeling. And therefore, omniscience is defined in terms of propositional knowledge, of knowing only and all truths, but not necessarily having all non-propositional knowledge. In fact, when you think about it, you'd be mentally ill if you had all non-propositional knowledge, because you would believe not only, for example, in my case, that I am Bill Craig, but I would believe I am Napoleon, or I am Ronald Reagan. Now, if Ronald Reagan believes that he is Ronald Reagan, or Napoleon believes he is Napoleon, that's a cognitive perfection. He is. Yeah. But if I were to believe that, that would be not a perfection, that would be an imperfection.
Right.
So to have all non-propositional knowledge would actually be a negative
So what you're telling me is to know everything is not to know everything.
Right. When we say to know everything, what we mean is knowing all truths, knowing all true propositions, and believing no false proposition. And therefore, it avoids these problems like, well, does God have to know what it's like to be Ronald Reagan? Well, no, only Ronald Reagan knows that. And if God believed he were Ronald Reagan, he would be mentally incompetent. So that's not a perfection. The idea of omniscience flows out of the perfection of God. St. Anselm defined God as the greatest conceivable being. Well, the greatest conceivable being would know all truth. And he would have appropriate non-propositional knowledge. He would know, I am God, I am omnipotent, I am omniscient. And but he wouldn't know, I am Ronald Reagan. That would be an imperfection.
But he would know what Ronald Reagan felt being Ronald Reagan.
Exactly, and that's a propositional truth, that Ronald Reagan knows that he is a movie star, that he is the president, that he has dealt with Gorbachev. All of those propositions God would know. He would know, for example, that it feels lousy to be a sinner, that sinners feel guilty and condemned, things of that sort. He would know all those propositions, but he wouldn't have that non-propositional knowledge of believing that he is himself Ronald Reagan, or that he is tasting a watermelon or something of that sort. So it's a subtle idea. I'm shocked, quite honestly, at how quickly you unearthed this. Normally, most people would just say, yeah, he knows only in all truth, and that's the end of it. But you're right. To be cognitively perfect, you actually have to be more than omniscient. You have to have
selective.
Yes, that's right. You have to have all propositional knowledge, and then you have to have, in addition to that, the appropriate non-propositional knowledge, appropriate to yourself. And both of those elements will be part of God's cognitive perfection. So God is actually greater than omniscient. And I remember when I first realized this, I was just stunned at the idea that God is even more cognitively perfect than being omniscient. I thought omniscience was the ultimate, and it's not. God is even more than omniscient. And
true omniscience, in the sense of knowing everything, would be total confusion.
Yes, that would be an imperfection, not a perfection, and therefore wouldn't be part of God's character as the most perfect being.
There are three kinds of characteristics of God's knowledge, which I'd like you to help me understand. Natural knowledge, free knowledge, and what's called middle knowledge.
Right. This is the way in which the Catholic Jesuit theologian Luis Molina in the 16th century analyzed God's knowledge. And what Molina said is that although everything God knows, he knows it once, nevertheless there is a kind of priority in God's knowledge, a sort of logical order or an explanatory order. And he said at the most fundamental level is God's natural knowledge. And this would be God's knowledge of everything that is necessarily true. 2 + 2 = 4. If it is raining, it is raining. Everything that has a shape has a size. Any necessary truths would belong to God essentially, and he could not lack that knowledge. This knowledge is natural to God and essential to God, so Molina called it natural knowledge. And this would include God's knowledge of all possibilities, everything that could happen, every possible world. Now, the third
That's logical. He couldn't square a circle or things like that.
that would be an impossibility.
Right.
So that's right.
Anything possible that's logically possible.
Yes, that's correct. And then in the third area, or tier of his knowledge, is what Molina called free knowledge. And this would be God's knowledge of all true, contingently true propositions that are dependent upon his will. And this would include things like George Bush is the President of the United States in 2001.
Now tell me why that's contingent. It's because it is not necessarily true.
It's not necessarily true, and moreover, it's dependent upon God's will which world to create. The free knowledge depends upon God's decision to create one world rather than another. And had he created a different world, quite a different set of propositions would have been true.
That's why they're contingent.
Exactly. And so he would have had different knowledge. So the free knowledge of God is not essential to God. He could have known other propositions to be true that are in fact false had he created a different world.
So now we have the two boundaries. We have natural knowledge, which is everything that God knows necessarily.
Yes.
And we have free knowledge, which are the contingent truths because God chose a certain world to actualize, to make real.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, now we have the two boundaries. Now what's in the middle?
Now, Molina's innovation was saying in between there is a third kind of knowledge, and for lack of a better name, he called it middle knowledge.
Okay, that I can follow.
It's in the middle. And middle knowledge is God's knowledge of what every possible person that he could create would freely do in any circumstances God might place him. So God would know, for example, that if I were to create Peter in a certain set of circumstances, he would deny Christ 3 times. Now, this kind of knowledge
And he would know, for example, that if I am in a situation asking you a question, I would ask you a silly question.
Right, and he would know that I would give a silly answer if I were in that set of circumstances.
Right.
Now, he might not want us to embarrass ourselves on television, and therefore he would not create us in those circumstances knowing we would be more serious. But the idea of middle knowledge is that prior to his decision, explanatorily prior to his decision to create a world, he knows how any possible person he might create would freely choose in any circumstances he might place that person. Now, this knowledge is unique because it is not necessary to God that he know this. It's dependent upon how we would freely choose. And we have the ability in those circumstances to do otherwise. So this knowledge isn't essential to God in the way that his natural knowledge is. It's contingent in the way that his free knowledge is. And yet, it isn't dependent upon his decision which world to create, because it is on the basis of his middle knowledge that God will then decide which persons to create and which persons to place them in.
Because explanatorily prior, he would know his middle knowledge of all the different possible worlds he could create.
Yes.
So he might choose a specific world to create based upon this middle knowledge,
exactly,
knowing the results of each world.
Exactly. And so in that sense, middle knowledge is like his natural knowledge, in that it's explanatorily prior to his decree to create a certain world. So in this explanatory hierarchy, you have natural knowledge, which is God's knowledge of everything that could be. Then you have his middle knowledge, which is his knowledge of everything that would be. Then you have the divine decree to create a particular world. And then posterior to that, finally, would be his free knowledge, and this is his knowledge of everything that will be. And that's Molina's theory of middle knowledge of God's omniscience.
Do you agree with that?
Yes. I think it's... When I first encountered this, I was stunned at the theological power of this idea. If you take this notion of middle knowledge and you apply it to various difficult theological conundrums, you will find it will be a key that will unlock the mystery to many of these difficult theological problems that folks have wrestled with for centuries. And I dare to say that I think this theory of middle knowledge is the most powerful theological concept that I've ever encountered in my life.
How free is God? What can God do and what can God not do?
The question you're raising is the question of divine omnipotence. And although omnipotence is very difficult to define with great philosophical precision, I think we can get a rough and ready idea of this property by saying that an omnipotent being is a being which is capable of doing anything that is logically possible for someone to do in that situation. So God can't do something like make a married bachelor or a round square. That's not an infringement of omnipotence, because those aren't really things. Those are just absurd combinations of words. And therefore God's ability to perform things would be limited only by logic.
The classic example is that, can God make a rock too heavy for him to lift?
Right, and that would be like a married bachelor. It's a self-contradictory description.
And so rather than being used as a way to discard theism, if you will, it is really a silly logical game, word game.
I think that's right, but these can be helpful in the following sense. I think that these kind of conundrums can actually be very helpful to the theist in helping to craft careful definitions of the various divine attributes. And it is possible to do this with divine omnipotence, but it would be a very long and complicated definition that wouldn't be helpful, I think, for this program. But the rough and ready idea that I gave, I think, will do.
What are some other aspects of the freedom of God? For example, could God not have ever made a creation? Was God free not to make a creation?
Well, certainly on the traditional Judeo-Christian view, creation is a freely willed act of God, and that therefore God could have refrained from creation. And philosophers will express this by saying that we can conceive of a possible world in which God alone exists. And there's no space, there's no time, there is nothing exterior to God. God alone exists in that possible world. And that does seem to be a conceivable world.
And God is also free to create multiple worlds and infinite numbers of multiple universes.
That's right. The idea that this universe is the only universe that exists isn't part of Christian theism or a commitment of traditional monotheistic theology. God, as infinite being, could create as many universes as he wanted to.
Are there other things that God is not free to do other than not doing logical contradictions?
I don't think so, though.
Can God sin?
No, for example. He couldn't sin because that would be a logical contradiction for an absolutely and essentially holy being to do evil.
So, but that requires you to define as God's essence
Yes.
a holy being who
Right.
is wholly good.
Right, and that I think is part of the definition of God. As St. Anselm said, God is the greatest conceivable being, and so he would have to be a perfect being, and that would include moral perfection.
I see a slight difference between God being unable to create a married bachelor and God being unable to sin because God is good. Because in one case, it's just a fundamental contradiction. In the other case, it's a contradiction of what you assume to be a hard and fast characteristic of God.
I don't think there's any metaphysical distinction between the two. Both of them describe logical impossibilities. But I think what you're hitting on is that when we think of a married bachelor, it's just very evident that that's a self-contradictory sort of description. But when you say a God who sins, that might not appear on the surface as contradictory to some people. But I do think that when you cash out the conception of who God is, namely the greatest conceivable being, a perfect being, then it's evident that moral imperfection would be incompatible with such a being, and therefore, if God exists, he would be essentially good, and therefore incapable of sin.
I can follow that if God is essentially good, then it is a contradiction. but it is an assumption, maybe it's true, that being essentially good is an absolute requirement of this perfect being.
That's right, though I think one can argue for that assumption, as I say, on the basis of the definition of who God is. I don't think that if there were a possible world in which there was a being that was very, very powerful, say, but was morally flawed, that being would be worthy of worship. To be worthy of worship, a being has to be morally perfect, and any being that is not worthy of worship can't be God, it would seem to me, because you wouldn't owe him worship, and God is to be worshipped. So I do think it belongs to the very concept of God, when you reflect on it, that he be morally perfect.
Some of these arguments, although making sense one to the other, do have a circularity to them, because you're saying, you're using the fact that you're characterizing a God to be worshipped as if worshipped is like an independent variable. I mean, maybe there's an omnipotent being who's almost perfect, and maybe we should worship or maybe not. I mean, I can't eliminate those possibilities.
But surely you can. I mean, think about it. Do you think if there were a being that were extremely powerful,
right,
that would merit worship? Does might make right? I don't think so. It seems to me that in addition to power...
Well, maybe he just tries as best as he can, and, it's almost perfect.
Yeah, well, then you would admire him, but you wouldn't worship him.
Well, I mean, I don't know. If he created me, I'd probably give him the benefit of the doubt.
Well, I think you might admire your creator, but I mean, you don't worship your parents, and so I don't think that just being one's creator or even being extremely powerful would merit the kind of attitude that worship involves. So the whole thing is what you mean by God. If you're talking about God with a big G, I do think things like moral perfection, omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence belong to the concept of that. If you're talking about God with a little g, like the gods of Greece and Rome or something, well, clearly those kinds of gods aren't morally perfect. So that's why I recur repeatedly to Anselm's concept of God as the greatest conceivable being, that there is no being conceivably greater than God. And since to be morally perfect is a perfection, a greatest conceivable being would have to be morally perfect. If there were some being that was morally imperfect, well, I could conceive of something greater than that, and so that being wouldn't be God.
According to that definition.
Yes.
Are there any other things that God can't do?
Yeah, I think that here we come to this issue that is raised by God's omniscience and the theory of middle knowledge, which says that there are statements about how people would freely choose in certain circumstances. And the interesting thing about these kinds of statements is that they are contingent. They are not necessary truths like the truths of mathematics. In different possible worlds, we may choose differently in the same circumstances, so they're contingent. And yet they are independent of God's will. God doesn't determine how you shall freely choose in the circumstances that you find yourself in. And what that means is...
So God is not then free to determine those acts.
That's right.
So that's a limitation on God's own freedom.
Yes, that's right. Because these are logically prior to his decree to create the world. And so if he has knowledge of these, they're called counterfactuals of freedom, about how people would act if they were in certain circumstances.
Define those terms, counterfactual.
Well, a counterfactual is an if-then statement in the subjunctive mood. Like, if I were rich, I would buy a Mercedes. Now, I'm not rich, and so I don't, but if I were, then I would. That's a counterfactual. It states an if-then hypothetical in the subjunctive mood. And the idea here is that God knows the truth value of all these counterfactuals about how creatures would freely choose in any circumstances they might be placed in. And if he does know these prior to his divine decree, then he doesn't determine those. He doesn't determine how you would act freely in any circumstances you might be in. And therefore, these lie, in that sense, outside his ability or power to determine. Now, what that means is that there are logically possible worlds which are not feasible for God to create, because if he were to place the creatures in those circumstances, they wouldn't do that thing. They would do something else. So the theory of middle knowledge says that are all of these possible worlds that God knows that are possibilities, but then there's a subset, a proper subset of these, which are all of the feasible worlds that God could actualize, given the truths of these counterfactuals of freedom about how creatures would act.
And then he chooses the one that he thinks are the proper ones to make real.
That's right. And then he will pick one of these feasible worlds to be the actual world. And so that's a very interesting, I think, limitation upon God's freedom. Again, it's purely logical because it's based upon the logical impossibility of making someone freely choose something. That is logically impossible. It's contradictory. So it's not an infringement on God's freedom that goes beyond logic, but it does have very interesting implications for God's providence over the world and for the evil and the imperfections that are in the world. Because it may be that there was no world feasible for God in which everybody always freely chose to do the right thing. It's possible that in any feasible world, some free creatures at least would go wrong and there would be sin and evil in the world. So this has very interesting repercussions for questions about the evil in the world and the other imperfections and limitations in the world.
Bill, can God change his mind?
I don't think that God can change his mind because as an omniscient being, he knows everything that will happen, including his own decisions. God has foreknowledge not only of everything that creatures will do, but also knowledge of his own acts.
That's not circular reasoning?
No, not at all. If God knows the truth value of all true future tense propositions,
including his own,
then he will know the truth value of propositions about his own actions, like God will part the Red Sea. He knows that. So God would have knowledge of everything in the future, and therefore there could be no basis for changing his mind. An omniscient being cannot change his mind. It would only be an ignorant being, a being that is ignorant, that could acquire some new reason for doing something that would cause him to change his mind.
You know, classically, I assume changing your mind would be considered an imperfection, something less than a perfect being, the greatest possible being. It's not clear to me that that would be the case, because a greater perfection to me might be an improvement, progress, making progress rather than eternally static.
Well, I think that might be the case for finite creatures. But if changing one's mind is, as I think, rooted in ignorance, then if ignorance is an imperfection, then a perfect being cannot change his mind. And it does seem to me that changing one's mind is rooted in ignorance. It is only someone who is ignorant and who can acquire a new reason for doing something that can say, aha, now I see it correctly, and I'm going to change my mind, and now I will improve. I will bring my thinking into accord with the way things really are, and that is an improvement. But that's rooted in a prior imperfection of being ignorant of what will be the case.
But if God is in the process of creating creatures like us, which you believe,
yes,
and that we are progressing towards higher states or towards closer relationships with God, God's accumulated life existence, because of our now coming into it, enhances God's existence, I would think. Or else, why did he do it?
I don't think it improves God. It doesn't render him more loving, more perfect, more knowing. Why did he do it? The answer would be, it cannot be for any benefit of his own, since he is already perfect. It can only be for the benefit of the creature. And therefore, I think that creation, like salvation, is an act of total grace on the part of God. It is not only salvation by grace that Christians believe in, but creation by grace. It is a condescension of God for the benefit and the sake of the creature, to give finite created persons the unfathomable privilege of coming into relationship with the source of infinite value and love and goodness, namely God himself.
And this does not improve God.
No, because God, existing in the self-sufficiency of his own being, is already perfect goodness, unalloyed holiness and perfection. He knows all truth. He's omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. So there isn't an improvement to God, but there is improvement to the creatures in that they come into relationship with this ultimate good.
There are some scriptures which, at least superficially to a layperson, looks like God's changing his mind.
Certainly.
Jonah and the whale and Nineveh, where God was going to destroy the city unless something happened, and he seemed to change his mind.
Right.
Wrestling and discussing with Abraham about what he's going to do to some of these cities or something. How do you deal with, from the biblical record which you support, how do you deal with those apparent accounts?
Yes. It's vital that we understand the literary genre or type of most of these biblical stories. The Bible is in the form of narratives. They're stories about God, told from the human point of view. And so a good storyteller will tell his story with all the vivacity and color that he wants to enhance his narratives. And so you'll find stories in the Bible about God told from a human perspective, where God not only lacks knowledge of the future, but even lacks knowledge of what's going on presently. God comes down to Abraham and says, I've heard the outcry in Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm going to go see if what's I've heard is really happening there. Well, that would deny not only God's foreknowledge, but his knowledge of the present. And there are other passages where God is spoken of in anthropomorphic terms as having nostrils and eyes and arms and other sort of bodily parts, wings. If you take all of these literally, God would be a sort of fire-breathing monster. And so these are anthropomorphisms. They are literary devices that are part of the storyteller's art and shouldn't be read like a philosophy of religion or systematic theology textbook. That's just a naive view of the type of literature that Scripture is.